able to use corals to record the vertical component of deformation for 1,000 years. Now, this is very complex work. It's being led by guys in Caltech that we work with. Oh. Back to the glasses. But it does allow us then to start tracking the history of earthquakes. And here, for example, is stuff that was published in Science magazine by a guy called Kerry C. from Caltech. And you can see that the coral ramps here and then it drops. So this is the depth of the water, and the depth drops whenever the earthquake happens because the seafloor pops upwards. So the depth of the coral experience gets smaller. Then over the next while, the coral ramps up again, and then it drops, and then it ramps up and drops. And we're able to take different coral heads from different places, hundreds of kilometers apart, and we're able to correlate the earthquakes across them. So we're able to now to start building up a picture in space and time of earthquakes in a quantitative way, which we couldn't do before. Now this is some of the work that we've got a lot of funding from the Natural Environmental Research Council for, is to try and take all the data from this and do a better job of reconstructing these past earthquakes. I'm going to show you in a minute or two why is it really important to understand the detail of what happened whenever an earthquake slipped. Because I believe it's only by understanding the detail of earthquakes that happened in the past that we're able to reconstruct the stress pattern today, which maybe will tell us what's going to happen tomorrow. Okay. I'm not going to go into detail of this because this is intensely mathematical stuff, but basically we have a data set which is the movement of corals during an earthquake, in this case that happened in 1797. What we basically do is we say generate a random earthquake within a computer simulation, and then we say what would that earthquake have done to these corals, and we compare the random earthquake deformation to what we see in the corals. Obviously it doesn't fit very often, so most of these are just ditched. But if you run about 500 million simulations like this, you end up getting maybe 50 or 60 of them for which the coral data look exactly like the type of model that you've run. This is a brute force Monte Carlo technique to try and reconstruct this. And that gives you a set of earthquakes that look like what must have happened at the time. And then we stack these together and do some statistical averaging of them. And this is what we come up with. So here is the row of islands again. The 2004 earthquake started here. This is an earthquake that happened in 1797. And this is the slip in it. So you can see that most of the slip happened just to the landward side of this row of islands here. I'm not going to go into the geography of their names and stuff. So in 1797, that happened. It was probably 8.7, 8.6 or 8.7. Notice you don't just get one answer using this type of technique, and we're developing statistical methods to understand the variability because of the uncertainty of the measurements we make. It produces an uncertainty in what happens during the earthquakes. Here's what happened in 1833, we believe, and that was a much bigger earthquake, probably between 8.9 and 9.2. The point is that using this coral data and some clever mathematical techniques, we're now able to reconstruct earthquakes that happened hundreds of years ago. And the project that we're working on, we're hoping to bring that back about 1,000 years.
That's per sounds. Tesla.
Okay, I apologize about this, but some of these pictures are quite a lot of information in them, so the whole presentation is about 85 megabytes, and the computer here wasn't able to run it. Unfortunately, I don't have the read from my own computer open. Okay, the next thing is, so we're able to reconstruct earthquakes in the past. What about how strain is being developed at the minute. So I've told you this plate is being forced onto that one. It's sticking and dragging this down, and then the earthquake happens. Turns out that's too simple, and when we look at the coral data and modern GPS data represented by these arrows, you'll see that in some places the arrows are short, in some places the arrows are long, in some places the colours of these corals are yellows and reds, and sometimes places they're blues and greens. That means that the whole picture of the deformation is not uniform. And the only way we can explain that, and again, you can take this information and produce a mathematical simulation which would result in this type of deformation. It tells me that some places here, the two plates are stuck tight and strain is accumulating really quickly. And in other places, such as in here, the two plates are not stuck tight and they're probably slipping past each other. You can think of this, and this is another representation of that, that where they're stuck, you're dealing with friction like sandpaper, and where they're not stuck, the two plates are more slipping past each other. That means that in any given period of time, some places these places are accumulating a lot of strain energy, and in other places they're accumulating very little. So that's starting to tell us the places where earthquakes might happen, and in places where earthquakes might not happen, and maybe earthquakes might even stop. And there is good evidence that the 2005 earthquake, which is shown here in that green contour, does map pretty well onto the area where the strain energy seems to be accumulating. But the 2007 earthquake, which we'll talk about later, doesn't match so well. The next thing is part of every time I give a talk, I get introduced as the person who predicted the 2005 earthquake. Well, we didn't predict it, and it's really important, the difference between prediction and what we did. We did some calculations which suggested another earthquake was likely in a particular place. We didn't say when. And when is an absolutely fundamental part of an earthquake prediction. And I don't believe we'll ever be able to say, well, when, and therefore I don't ever use the word prediction except to say that you can't do it. Okay? Here's the technique. Now, again, I'm just showing you the diagrams, and behind this there's some pretty complex maths and physics, but the basic idea is the same as the Hooke's law experiment you've all done at school here. Whenever you put on a force onto an elastic body, the elastic body deforms. Now, it's a bit more complicated when you're trying to do that in 3D, but the principle's still the same. And basically, if we have an earthquake that happens along a set of vertical faults, so we're looking at it in a map view, the earthquake happens, the faults do this. We can then calculate what the surface, what the stress would be in the area surrounding that earthquake. Now, what we can do, basically, is we can say, where around there are other earthquakes made more likely by that stress? Clearly, near the fault, you get a relaxation. So the fact that the fault itself isn't likely to slip again. But immediately around that, and in lobes away from it, the ground has actually, the Earth's crust has been made more likely to have other earthquakes. And the result is, if we do that calculation, we get a pattern like this. So you're expecting aftershocks here, along here, and up here. And when we look at 18 months of aftershocks following this earthquake in California, the Landers earthquake, you can see that most of the aftershocks, which are the small pluses here, happen in the red areas. Now, we have been working on this for about 10 years, and when the Sumatran earthquake happened, the 2004 tsunami earthquake, Joe, do you think could we
No problem.
go on? This is. Could we go on to your laptop? See if you can get it. Okay, so the 2004 earthquake happened. I was on holiday in Donegal with my family, and one of the newspapers phoned me up and said, what do you think about this earthquake? I hadn't heard anything about it. But when went online, got the information, I immediately phoned the people in my research group, and I said I want everybody back in the lab the next day. And we immediately started working really hard to try and work out what the stress would be like around this earthquake. So we have a Californian girl, woman, and a Turkish guy who have both come to Coleraine to study earthquakes with somebody from Derry. Isn't that amazing? We basically came up with this picture. I'm not going to talk about this. This is the important thing. This red coloration means that the megathrust, where the Australian and Indian plates are being forced under the Sumatran block, has been increased in stress as a result of the 2004 earthquake. So we immediately got a paper written. We had the first paper written on that earthquake anywhere in the world. We were the first group. We submitted the paper to Nature on the 10th of January 2005. They took 3 months to review it. One of the reviews was longer than the paper. So this basically goes to other scientists. The other scientists read the thing and then they make smart comments about it. We answered the review's comments, and the editor of Nature published the paper almost exactly as we wrote it in the first place. It came out on St. Patrick's Day of 2005, and the earthquake happened just here, magnitude 8.7, which was the third or fourth biggest earthquake ever recorded at that time, on the 28th of February, which is 11 days after the earthquake. So, just as a slight aside, I did 150 interviews with the press and TV and stuff. Every interview started the same way. You've predicted this earthquake? No, I haven't. So it's really important for people to, whenever you're dealing with, for scientists when you're dealing with media, to try and make sure to keep the message simple, but you can't allow people to think that you're able to do things that you can't do, even if it sounds more interesting.
I've got something on here for you.
Okay.
We're going to have to use it from the keyboard.
That's okay.
I'll swap it for you now.
Thank you. Fingers crossed we won't have. Okay. We then, the Vice Chancellor of our university was really happy with my research paper because we published 2 papers in Nature in 2 months. So as soon as this earthquake happened, we redid the calculations, and everybody else in the world stood back and said, okay, this is your job. And we weren't even in a big rush to do this, though we did it quickly nonetheless. And we pointed out, the city of Padang is just here. This area here then has been loaded with an extra amount of stress from the 2005 earthquake. So what we're suggesting, that these interaction studies, earthquake interaction where one earthquake seems to talk to another, indicate that the area under this island of Siberut, I'm going to talk a bit about that over the next half hour or so, is being loaded by an extra amount of stress as a result of the 2005 earthquake. Here's another problem with prediction. Can I shake your hand? Now, gently. You feel the amount of stress that I'm applying here in a very soft handshake. Gentle. Yeah? That's the amount of stress that caused this earthquake to happen. About 0.2 of a bar. If I give you a proper handshake, that's about 1 bar. Okay? Now, that amount of stress liberated more than, I believe, 20,000 nuclear bombs of the Hiroshima variety. So you can see this is what's called an extremely non-linear process. What you get out is not related at all to what you put in. It's a triggering effect, which means that if we're going to predict earthquakes, in other words, say we know exactly what's going to happen next, you need to be able to measure stresses in the crust down to that degree of precision over the whole area. Some scientists don't agree with me, but I think the majority of us now believe that that's absolutely forbidden, even by Heisenberg uncertainty. I think whenever you get down to it, that there's sufficient absolute uncertainty in the whole problem. The next thing, and this is where we're getting into the really great use of broadband seismometers and GPS. the recent earthquakes that have happened have been really well recorded, so we know a lot about what happened recently. Here's an example. This is a paper we published in Nature Geoscience a couple of years ago. And basically you can see the detail with which these coloured contours are the amount of slip that happened in the 2005 earthquake, the one we forecast. Here's the amount of slip that happened in an earthquake that happened in 2007. And I want you to notice that there's a gap here in that slip. Okay, I'm going to come back to that in a minute because I think that there's an amazing correspondence between that gap and something else you've already seen. And a guy called Thornley from California did a really good job on inverting and telling us what the slip was like in an earthquake that happened in 2010. And that this earthquake was too small to generate a tsunami, and yet it did generate a tsunami, and it killed 500 or 600 people. It was what we call a slow earthquake. The rupture wasn't fast, it propagated really slowly. That allows it to couple better with the water column, and you get a more efficient transfer of energy from the earthquake into the water column. So you get a tsunami even though you shouldn't. And this is another example of why all of this is provisional. Nobody knew anything about tsunami earthquakes 10 years ago. Now they're a big area of research. Okay, and one last thing I'm not going to talk much about, but after an earthquake happens, the earth keeps slipping, sometimes for years afterwards. I'm putting this in because it's part of the total amount of slip budget that we have. I'll talk to you about that in 5 minutes or so. Okay, so here then is the position in Sumatra, and everybody who looks at that should be able to start putting together some ideas about what's going to happen next. So this is more or less the situation now. There are earthquakes that happened in 2007. There's an earthquake happened in 2005. This is the 1797 earthquakes happened somewhere in this area. The 1833 earthquake happened somewhere in this area. This earthquake happened in 1861. This one happened in 2010. And this is the way the plates are coupled, so where the strain is building up is the red bits. Where it's not building up, it's white. And the question I could ask all of you, if we had more time, is to tell me what you think is going to happen next. Well, I'll tell you, obviously, in this area just north of Sibirut, the 2005 earthquake has increased the stress. This hasn't broke since 1797, so it's quite clear. The next earthquake is going to happen under Sibirut Island, and it's going to be something like the earthquakes that have happened here before, mid-magnitude 8s, 8.5 to 8.8 or something like that. Right? Before anybody believes that, we would need to, before governments are going to invest a lot of money to do the things that we need to do to try and protect people from an earthquake like this, we need to be able to show them that that actually works. And one thing that we've done is, we went and studied the Maule earthquake which happened in Chile in 2010. So, along with a guy called Stefano Loreto and his colleagues in the Italian National Institute for Geophysics in Rome, we looked at what was the situation immediately before the Maule earthquake. And it's remarkably like the Sumatran situation. You can see there's an earthquake here that happened in 1985. There's one that happened here in 1928. The biggest earthquake ever recorded was the 1960 Chile earthquake, magnitude 9.5. And then there's a gap. And strangely, we know a lot about what happened the last time that gap had an earthquake, because there was a guy called Charles Darwin, happened to be there when the earthquake happened in 1835 on his voyage of the Beagle. He was a smart guy. He described stuff about the way the ground moved during the earthquake, which really captured a lot of information about that earthquake, and it's described so clearly. And he also suggested that why you get fossils, marine fossils, high up in mountains was because of the accumulation of that